Recording, and now it's recording. Hi everyone, thanks for being here today. We're very pleased to host today Bård Harstad, who's a professor in business and sustainability and professor of political economy at Stanford. He's going to talk about political commitment bonds. Before I give you the floor, let me tell you that this is the last seminar of the term. We go on a break, and you may receive news from us again about what's going to happen next in the next semester. So starting January, we may communicate, but at the moment, this is the last seminar of the semester. And now the floor is yours. Bart's happy to take questions as they go, as we usually do.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me and for being online. I just praised the organizers for the webinar because I think it's perfect and wonderful to be able to meet in person. So what I will do is that I will present a very much work in progress. It's still, I don't know what the title is going to be. I don't know what the content is going to be, if this is going to be one paper or more or no paper at all. So this is a perfect time for me to get comments, although it's not a perfect for you to learn anything. But I hope it will be interesting anyway. So it's a theory paper, but it's based on a number of important and recent empirical developments. And in particular, it's motivated by Uruguay's original idea to issue sustainability-linked bonds. So what is that? That is a bond which Chile issues. It has a 20-year maturity. The yield is 4.3%, but it's not fixed. It's not a fixed yield. In fact, it depends on something which they call sustainability performance target. The target number one is to limit emissions to 95 million tons CO2 equivalents by 2030. And that is down from approximately 130 million tons a few years ago. So it's a big reduction in CO2 equivalents, which they try to achieve. The idea is that if they fail with this target, then they pay more on the bond. There will be a step up in the interest rate or the yield on the bond, so that it will be costly for Chile to fail on this target. That is why it's sustainability linked. In fact, it's a bit more interesting even because they have a second sustainability performance target, and that is that they should have at least 50% of the energy coming from renewables by 2028. And if they fail this, there will be a step up in the yield or the interest rate. So it will be more costly if they fail this. If they fail both, it will be the combined step up. If they fail none of them, there would be 4.3% yield. So they are to some extent selling a lottery to investors where the interest rate is higher if Chile is failing with those performance targets. So in the same year, 2022, these were also issued by Uruguay. Uruguay did something similar. I will not go into details. They are interesting details. That's not the point of this paper, but they did something very similar. For them, it was one of the sustainability targets where how much national forest they were protecting and maintaining. So they used forest also as one of the indicators that they influenced whether the interest rate would step up, or in their case, it could also step down. If they succeed or if they overachieved with the target, the interest rate would also go down. And since then, we have seen last year Thailand was doing something similar. Not on forest, but on electric vehicles. So what I will talk about is these type of policy-linked bonds. So let me try to move the screen so I can actually see you right away. Okay, so these bonds is having a repayment amount. I will not talk about the interest rate because that will be then the repayment, the cost will be proportional to the loan. But I will just fix that a repayment at some R, and that will depend on basically some state of the world in the future. And for sustainability-linked bonds, this R is smaller if the government succeeds with the sustainability goal. In other situations, you can think more generally about this. In principle, this R can be a function of all types of policies, which the government is having plans about for the future. This linkage can also be implicit. You can talk about more complicated setting where the government is taking a loan, it's giving equity in a firm or in a particular type of industry, and also then the amount of yield or the repayment is going to be connected to what type of policy the government is implementing. So, and of course, you can think about insurance contracts too. It's a link there. So how I will think about this formally is in a very simple way. I will think that there is a period 0 where there is an incumbent, P0, who issues a bond where there is a repayment R as a function of X, where X is the policies that it shows in the future. This incumbent may stay in power or not. It stays in power with probability P. We can endogenize P later, but for now, as a start, I will just think about it as being exogenous. Thereafter, there is a new policymaker, or maybe the same, who is going to decide on this policy X. That policy X is going to influence whether the country achieves, for example, the sustainability target. And that in turn will influence the repayment R of X. So that's the simple game. And thereafter, the P1 can basically decide on any X. Taking into account this both one's own preference or benefit or cost of X, but also the fact that this is going to influence how much it repays. There is a limit to how much the policymaker can repay. So it's not possible for any country in the world to borrow infinitely much, partly because of the incentive that then in that case, the policymaker would rather default on the debt than instead of repaying a very large amount. So there is a possibility of default. One can make it more interesting. Here I will make it very simple. There is a cost of default which is equal to K. If you default, you lose K. K can be a fraction of the GDP or it can be a function of how much you trade with other countries, because some of these foreign assets can be frozen and can be seized if you are defaulting on the debt. You might lose access to future credit market that will also influence and then endogenize K. Okay, so of course the policymaker at time 1 can have preferences that differ from those at time 0. There can be several reasons for that. You can think about parties who are left-wing versus right-wing. Then if I'm a left-wing party, there is a chance that the right-wing party will be in power. They will have different preferences for what X should be than what I will have. But that's not the only reason why preferences can differ. You can think about just a regular time inconsistency problem. If I'm in office, I would like to do something else than if my opponent is in office, not necessarily because they have different preferences, but because if I'm in office, I have the possibility to spend the money on whatever I want, and then I would like to save money to spend it on what I want instead of spending money on, for example, the green transition, which I would like to postpone so that it will be the expense of another policymaker in the future to pay for the green transition, for example. So there is a time inconsistency where we would like to postpone costly reform or move forward, for example, extraction of resources, because then I get the revenue myself. But if I don't know whether I will be in office or not in the next period, I might have a preference that the future policymaker should extract less or save more or implement the green transition, because with some chance it's not going to be me. If it happens to me, I would like to undo this, and that creates a time inconsistency problem or a conflict between what is optimal for me ex ante versus ex post. So that's the second reason why the P1 and P0 might have different preferences over X. So it's a very simple game. And now, what kind of questions can we ask before we analyze this? Is this the end of democracy? If I can tie the hands of the policymakers in the future, what is left to decide for that party? Or more specifically, we could ask, what policies will I, as the incumbent today, be able to implement for the future? What are the constraints? What are the limits? What are the costs for me if I try to implement a policy X prime? What is the equilibrium policies in this type of game? And you could ask whether the voters would lose from this contingency. And what about other actors? For example, we talked about deforestation. There is a possibility that you can get compensation for conserving forests from the World Bank, IMF, Norway, UK, Germany. For example, there are already contracts where countries are paying for the conservation of tropical forest in Brazil and Peru and many other countries. These donors may also be able to issue loan or to give loans where the interest rate is depending on the performance, for example, about forest conservation in the country that is borrowing the money. Then the question could be, will they lose from this contingency? Isn't it less expensive to do it as they do it today? Namely, that they are not paying P0 for a reduction in forest in the future. Instead, they are paying the P1 to reduce deforestation rates at that time. So one could think about whether that is less expensive, and the answer to that question, and also the other questions here, are going to be no. This is not the end of democracy. This is not going to be worse for the voters. The voters are going to benefit from this contingency. It's not something that will destroy competition between the parties. In fact, both the timing consistency problems will in part be able to be something that you can address. And policies, if you have left and right-wing parties setting policies, the policies in equilibrium will be more moderate than without this policy-linked bonds. So, and not only that, but also the sovereign borrowing, or the amount of repayment that the voters will have to suffer because the next policymaker at time one is going to repay the debt. That amount is also going to be reduced in equilibrium. And if there are donors who could pay P1 for reducing deforestation, they will be better off by issuing a loan where the interest rate is depending on X in the future, according to this simple analysis. So that would mean, for example, that more forests can be conserved per dollar if the donor give a loan, a forest-linked loan, where the interest rate is depending on deforestation level, instead of giving a grant or a payment for ecosystem services to P1 at the time one. And then one can even calibrate the model to derive how much you can actually save on the conservation by lending, by this type of loan, compared to payment for ecosystem services, the conservation agreement REDD+, or what is Brazil was just proposing now at the COP30 meeting, the climate meeting. They proposed something which is called TFFF, which was also a kind of a grant scheme to pay tropical forest countries to conserve forest. So I can also compare conservation by lending to show that they can conserve much more per dollar with that instrument compared to those existing instruments. So the outline is that I will talk first about intratemporal disagreements like left-wing, right-wing parties before we introduce intertemporal agreement like timing consistency problem, and then you can combine the two. So that's the plan. But I'm happy to take questions before I continue with the speed.
Yes. I just wanted to ask this, Bård. So this is an interesting idea. I didn't know about these policy targeted bonds, but let me try to be devil's advocate. You didn't show much of the model, but you modeled the cost of default as K. Now, with standard debt, default happens because debt is homogeneous in a way. It's money, right? It's not policy targeted and so on. So default occurs because we just cannot repay, or we choose not to repay a certain amount. And with it comes a penalty in terms of the ability to borrow in the future, reputation, and so on, which is here I can envisage, say, for example, somebody, some left-wing government does a lot of these environmentally linked bonds, and then a right-wing government goes to power, and they can say, look, we're going to default on these because we just don't want to do these targets. But, you know, we don't have a financial problem. We're going to repay, we're going to set new bonds and so on. It's not a financial problem. We don't. So I can see how, in principle, it wouldn't be too hard to neutralize this kind of instrument. And here, for any policy, because the real cost of default in general is on the ability to repay, the perceived ability to repay. I mean, the lenders, most lenders won't care what the policy makes as long as the money is coming. Now, of course, you do have some lenders that are probably linked to that. So I'm wondering whether this is really, I mean, I didn't see anything that you said that would address this question. Maybe you have something about that.
So I think that in practice, I think it will be important for example, the donor in this case, to make sure that it's not easy for the borrower to do selective default. And I think that it could be quite tempting for a borrower to say, for example, don't worry, I will handle all ordinary debt just as I have done before, but this particular type of debt, which was issued by the previous policymaker in order to tie my hands, that is something which is very different. I will not honor that particular debt. That would be selective default. So one could think that even for that case, there will be some kind of default cost. And it might be small, it might be big. It's written as K. But I think that it's very important for the kind of the donor and the lender to raise this cost, because then this instrument will be more powerful, as I will explain. So they will raise it, and one way of raising it is to tie to make it impossible to do selective default, to select on this particular loan instead of other loans. And there are ways of doing that. For example, when you issue a sovereign debt, you have to negotiate the seniority of this particular debt. And seniority means that if this particular loan is quite senior, it will have to be repaid first. You cannot repay other loans according to international law and contract before repaying this loan. That is something the contract can specify and they can negotiate, and that would be a way to solve this problem to some extent. Maybe I'm not sure if I completely answered your question, but
no, of course. So you're saying the borrower actually, when a government, when it omits that, would probably, a left-wing government, say in my example, would then say, okay, we're going to make it very senior, regardless of and that is going to tie up a future government's hands. They won't be able to default on this selectively. That's your answer.
This instrument will work more effectively if you can make sure that this loan is senior, to put it this way. Yeah. Ali, you have a question too?
Yeah, I was thinking about the private market. I think we see these loans in corporations too. And I'm wondering if you have thought about, whether they also solve the time inconsistency problem in corporation too, or whether there are other motives.
Yes. That's a good point. So I think that when I introduced this and I said that Uruguay had this great initiative or idea to introduce sustainability linked bonds in 2022, then actually what I should have said is that they were the first in the world to do this from the state level, from the sovereign. But there were already companies. In particular, I think the first company was an energy company in Italy who first issued sustainability linked bonds from the corporate side. And many corporations are doing that. And that's a bit more interesting. If there are timing consistency problem within firms, then they can also use this to kind of just tie their hands in the future. And the timing consistency problem for the firms will be different from that of the government. I'm not completely sure whether the rationale is going to be the same, because I think there could be other reasons for corporations. So, but this analogy is certainly something that I should have a better answer to. But I will now focus on politics.
Can I ask also a very quick question, because about a theoretical possibility. So here, the commitment is really for the policymaker in period 2, but in principle, you can extend it and have a government issuing a bond which will force the government to pay a lot of money if voters vote for the opponent.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Exactly.
All kinds of things like that.
Yeah, so you can do that too. So I have an answer to that, which I will get to for those. So number 1 and 2 are 2 examples of models in which we can discuss this. In none of these models will it matter, at least not in the first, whether you could make this contingency, whether the repayment can be a function also on who you re-elect. But of course, there are other models where that could be quite important. That might be a bit more tricky, because one could, if you can make it actually compare to, whether foreign, where the international political system is willing to honor that type of contract, maybe it's more questionable than if the country is trying to solve a domestic timing consistency problem. Okay, but so let me start with this intertemporal disagreement. So what that means, so it's a very simple model. It's almost like an example. There is a value of the policy x, which is VIX for party I. This function is concave, and I can be the left or the right party. They have a preference x superscript I, which is simply the x that is maximizing its own utility function. The median voter is assumed to have some ideal point in between, and it's going to be indifferent between the 2 parties. It's not going to be an important assumption. I will probably not use this assumption at all in this presentation, given what I need to focus on. But the timing is just as I already explained. The incumbent at time 0 is issuing a bond, and it will then be able to consume the expected rate of return of this bond. So that's kind of the benefit of issuing the bond, in addition to the possibility to influence future policy. You're staying in power with property P. Then at time 1, there is a left or right-wing party is setting policy X, and then that party will maximize its own value of the policy, minus the fact that you have to repay the loan, and you have to pay the repayment on the bond, and that is a function of X as well. And here I introduce delta. Delta is just how important it is for you to save money or to raise revenues if you are in power compared to when you are not in power. This delta is the reason why you would like to borrow, for example, in the absence of any of this contingency. If you are in power today and you get 1 plus delta, then you would like to borrow because you are only going to repay 1 plus delta multiplied with P, but P is the probability that you are staying in power. If you are measuring all these cost and benefits of borrowing as the present discounted value at time 1, so that so that will give that. So if you have the same discount factor as the investors in the market, then because of the delta and the P is smaller than 1, you have an incentive to borrow as much as you can, because with some chance you don't have to repay it, and then the cost is 1 instead of 1 plus delta, and 1 plus delta is the benefit of getting more money when you are in power, as you are as the incumbent at time 0. One could think about delta as being larger, for example, if there is a lot of polarization, in the economy because delta is measuring how important it is, how beneficial it is to spend money when you are incumbent compared to when you are not incumbent. And the benefit is that I can spend the money on my favorite party perks or local public goods or things that I like especially much. Compared to when my opponent is in power, I might benefit from all these expenditures, but maybe to a limited extent because that's not my favorite project. You might also think that corruption will be positively associated with delta, because if there is corruption, then I can keep some of the revenues or some of the budget that is saved, which I'm not paying on loan, for example. I can keep some of that money in myself. So then you can also think that, okay, for in a corrupt society or in a polarized society, delta might be larger. Okay, so and as I mentioned, the P1 can default at cost K, and every dollar, such as which is K is measured in dollar, that is multiplied with 1 plus delta when you are in power. And if you default, you are free to set any X. Then you're not bound by this because the repayment is not you're not going to repay the bond anyway. So then you're free to set your ideal X. So that's the simple model. Now I squeezed in this version of the model in the one simple slide. And then we are ready to look on what's the outcome of this game, which I just described on this slide. So the outcome, first a benchmark result. If K was 0, because as you mentioned, Francisco was talking about what is the cost of default and so on. If there is no cost of default, I cannot borrow. And in that case, it's not possible for an incumbent today to influence what the future policymaker will do, because the future policymaker will set X1 equal to the bliss point of that policymaker, which is X superscript 1 by definition. So then that is the simple. So if you have the left wing or the right wing party, whoever it is who will be in power at time 1, that will just influence the ideal point of that party. By comparison, the median voter is strictly better off for every K plus positive K when the incumbent has the possibility to issue policy contingent bonds. The median voter is always better off in this model. And the value for the median voter of X is larger, and also the repayment that will actually occur in equilibrium, that is going to be smaller. The larger is K, the larger is the median voters payoff. So let me try to explain, because if the policymaker at time 0 is, say, the left-wing party, and if the left-wing party will stay in power, the left-wing party in equilibrium will just implement the ideal point. But if the left-wing party and I'm incumbent at time 0, I will be able to induce my opponent to implement an X which is different from my opponent's ideal point. In particular, it's the X that is going to be chosen in the next period by my opponent, if my opponent wins. That is going to be a weighted average between what I prefer and what my opponent prefer. And to implement this, it will be enough with a simple step function where R is a function of X in a very simple way. It's a constant up to some X and then it jumps. So let me just explain the intuition for this. So basically what I will, the way we can explain and understand this result can be, it can be explained by the following lemmas. Look, if I'm the policymaker, if I'm the incumbent at time 0, I can implement any X chosen by opponent if and only if this utility my opponent will get from picking that X compared to her favorite X if that is less than the cost of default. How can I do it? Well, I can do the following. I can say that, look, if my opponent is picking her favorite X, the repayment is going to be as large as possible. I want to make that ideal point of my opponent unattractive. So then I will promise a repayment equal to K if that X superscript R is chosen. And then to motivate my opponent to pick an X which is closer to my ideal point, I will promise that the repayment on the bond is going to be smaller for my opponent if another more moderate X is chosen. So that is, and then I can reduce it all the way to say 0, and that limits how close I can get X to be to my ideal point. And the larger is K, the larger is the cost of default, the more I can make it unattractive for my opponent to pick her favorite policy, and therefore I can use my opponent to pick a policy which is closer to my ideal point as a way to not have to repay a very large interest rate on those bonds.
I have a question. So, but isn't a consequence of this that if resources are very unequally distributed, this is a tool for the elite to capture power to just prevent any reform in the future?
Yeah, you would think so. So what I emphasize here is that this is good for the voters. Now I will talk about resource extraction in a moment. This is more about the left-wing, right-wing policy. And what the equilibrium of this is that if I'm an incumbent today, I will force or I can induce my opponent to pick a policy which is different from her ideal point. And what I will prefer then is that my opponent picks a policy which is closer to my ideal point. And that is good for the voters if you think that the median voter has an ideal point somewhere in between. Because the policy of my opponent becomes more moderate. It's good. I do it for myself, not because I think about the median voter, but if the median voter has an ideal point in between, this is also good for the median voter. You get a more moderate policy. So let me just explain the intuition now for why I don't want to pull the X I implement all the way to my ideal point. I don't want to do that. Why? Because when I motivate my opponent to pick a smaller X, then I have to promise that for that particular X, there will be a smaller repayment. There will be a smaller repayment for the loan compared to the K that my opponent must repay if her favorite policy is chosen. But promising a smaller repayment is costly for me, because when the investors understand that they will be repaid less when a more moderate X is chosen, then I can raise less money in the first place. When I try to sell these bonds and my investors understand, look, they are not going to get anything left back because the opponent can choose a moderate X, which leads to low repayment, then I raise less money today. And that's costly for me because I really would like to borrow as much as I can, given the positive delta. And that creates a trade-off. If I want to implement an X, on the one hand, I prefer an X which is closer to me, my ideal point, but that becomes more and more costly because the incumbent is then preferring more and more to default on the debt, given that my opponent dislikes the more moderate X. And in return, I have to reduce the repayment on that when that X is chosen. I have to reduce it so much that I cannot borrow very much. And that creates a trade-off. So that is why the optimal X, from my point of view, is going to be interior, even if in principle, I could perhaps be able to induce my opponent to pick my favorite X. That will be very costly for me because it's going to be very attractive for that policymaker to rather just give a shit and default on the debt. And when that is expected, I cannot borrow very much.
There's a question from Ali.
Yeah, Ali.
Yes, just clarification. I didn't catch the bond, like how much the incumbent borrow and how much he has to pay. And also, I'm wondering if there is what a social planner will do in this case. What someone who weighs the utility of the two policymakers will do.
Yeah, so I didn't introduce the social plan. So the social plan, what I said was that the median voter is better off because of this moderation. If I introduced a social planner, I would probably have a social planner that had the same welfare function as the median voter. And the median voter, the social planner is then also better off because of this moderation. But in that case, of course, if the planner could dictate the policies, they would dictate that X should be right in the middle, or it should be just exactly equal to the median ideal point of the median voter. If you could dictate,
there will be no default.
Sorry.
There will be no default.
There will be no default. There will be no default in this equilibrium either. So what is going to happen is that if I'm an incumbent today, I would like to borrow as much as possible. But I cannot borrow too much because at some point the incumbent in the next period will rather default. And that limits how much I can. And of course, if the next policymaker is defaulting, that policymaker can decide on whatever X she wants. So that limits how much what the repayment can be for that ideally chosen X and time one, at time period one. So to make it possible to implement a more moderate X, which is closer to my ideal point, I have to make sure that the repayment on after choosing such an X is smaller. And because that is going to be implemented in equilibrium, the investors are really interested in that repayment. And when that is small, because I'm trying to motivate the next policymaker to choose a more moderate X, then I will raise less money in the first place. So that creates the trade-off. So let me actually, we can endogenize X.
Sorry,
Pete.
Yeah, I just want to understand the notation because I'm a little bit lost. How much the incumbent borrow and how much do they have to pay? Just define the bond. I missed that point. The notation.
Okay.
Yeah.
In principle, if I'm an incumbent, I promise a repayment R of X, and the investors understand what the equilibrium is going to be. It might be different if the left or right-wing party will be elected, but the expected rate of return is what they are willing to pay for that bond. And that expected rate of return is what the incumbent at time zero will put in his pocket at time one. In equilibrium, what I will do is that if I'm an incumbent at time zero, is that I will because I like the X, I like two things. I like to borrow a lot, but I also like the X in the future to be close to my ideal point. And that creates a conflict because the closer is X to my ideal point, the more I must make it attractive for the next policymaker to select that X instead of just defaulting and select her favorite X. So that means that I must promise a lower repayment for a more moderate X. And so in equilibrium, that R will be smaller, and exactly how small it will be, that depends on my intensity of preferences. I don't have a function, I didn't include an equation for that repayment, but it's going to be smaller than K because I would like to implement a smaller X. Not smaller X, but an X which is closer to my ideal point. And then there will be a balance. I would like to implement an X which is smaller to my ideal point, but the more I push in this direction, the more I have to reduce the repayment when that X is chosen. And because the repayment is smaller, I cannot raise very much money at time zero. And that creates a trade-off. I think actually it might be. Let me actually skip. So there, we can endogenize P. I will not do it because I want to do something else. I think that these questions are very useful, and it shows where some of the confusion is in this model. I think that the confusion might be less after I talk about the intertemporal agreement. So now you can think about the policy Y, for example, extracting a resource like deforestation, and that gives a benefit V subscript 1 of Y in period 1. But that valuation of Y might be different from how I value at time 0, how I value Y. So there might be, for example, a time inconsistency problem, so that we have the present incumbent has a different value of the policy compared to the time 1 incumbent. So again, I will then, if I'm an incumbent today, I will just issue a bond where the repayment is a function of the chosen policy at time 1, which is Y. But this repayment can be at most K, because otherwise the incumbent in time 1 will just default. Based on equilibrium repayment, I will be able to raise an amount from the investors, which is equal to that when we measure all these payments as the present discounted values at time 1. So, and again, I stay in power with some probability. Whoever is in power at time 1 is maximizing the value function of time 1 minus the cost of repaying those bonds. So, but there is a constraint that the policymaker at time 1 can just default and set any Y. So now we have an intertemporal agreement, disagreement, where the agreement is just being between time 0 and time 1. And of course, as a benchmark result, if it's not possible, if there is no cost of defaulting, if K is 0, or if there is no contingency connected to those bonds, then the policymaker at time 1 will just maximize the value function. So it will be so it will just implement the idle point at that time. But compared to that, it will again be the case that the median voter is strictly better off for every positive K. If you assume that the median voter has a value function which is coinciding with the value function at time 0. Or, yeah. So, in particular, Y is going to be implemented Y in time, which is decided on in time 1. It's going to be closer to the ideal point that is preferred from time 0's point of view. The repayment from in time 1 is also going to be smaller, so the voters will be burdened by a smaller repayment in equilibrium. And the reason is, of course, that the incumbent at time 0 will implement a timing consistent, or a Y which is more timing consistent, by promising a lower rate of return when that particular Y is chosen than when the period 1's policymaker ideal point is chosen. So I will induce the future policymaker to choose a more policy which is more similar to what I preferred at time 0, by making sure that the bond is having a lower rate of return when that moderate Y is chosen, compared to when the ideal point of the future policymaker is chosen, because that ideal point is going to lead to will then request a repayment K, which is the highest repayment I can promise. So yeah, so again, it's going to be the Y I implement is going to be a weighted average between what the incumbent prefers at time 0 compared to what the policymaker prefers at time 1. And interestingly, oops, yeah. So let me not discuss a comparative static in interest of time. But again, it will be sufficient with a single step function. It will then be the case that I will issue a bond which has a low repayment when for example, suppose that Y is extraction level or deforestation level. The problem is that the future policymaker is going to deforest too much. At time 0, you would like the deforestation level to be smaller. What I can do today is I can issue a bond where the repayment is going to be smaller if deforestation rates are small. If instead deforestation rates are going to be high, the repayment will be higher, just as the bonds issued by Uruguay. And to implement in this simple model is enough with a single step function. That is, the repayment will be high if the next policymaker's ideal point is chosen, but it will be lower if deforestation rates will be so small that it satisfies this first order condition. So let me actually go to that example. So you can think about, if you think about Y as deforestation levels, this creates benefit and cost. The benefit is that you can sell the land to loggers or agriculture, and you can get revenues. And the value of revenues when you are in power is 1 plus delta. There might be cost, and that could be the environmental cost, which is borne by everyone. And that is the C of Y. If you don't know whether you are in power in the future or not, then your value of Y is not B of Y multiplied with 1 plus delta, but multiplied with 1 plus delta times P. Because P is the probability that you get the additional value of revenues when you are in power, compared to when your opponent is in power. So there, given this, when the P is less than 1, you can see that the incumbent at time 0 prefer a lower extraction level, a lower deforestation level, than what the policymaker will prefer at time 1. Because when you know that you're in power, you know that you are getting the full 1 plus delta when you raise revenues, and you would like to you are raising more revenues, whereby deforesting more. So this is a typical timing consistency problem, where at time 0 you would like the deforestation level in the future to be lower, but if you happen to be in power, you would like it to be higher. So you can partly solve the timing consistency problem by issuing a bond which promising a lower rate of return when deforestation rates are lower. So, and let me say something about in the end, because this benefit will not only be present for bonds. You can also think about, suppose that the policy incumbent cannot issue policy-linked bonds, but there is a donor who also benefits from, say, forest conservation, who can offer a policy-linked loan. The World Bank has started to do this to a smaller extent. That means that the donor is lending an amount, a quantity Q, to P0 in return for a repayment, which is a function of the R which is chosen at time 1. So this policymaker who is accepting this quantity stays in power with some property P, and that the next P1 in time 1 is then going to decide on the deforestation level in order to maximize the benefit at that time, which is that you get the revenues from deforestation multiplied with 1 plus delta because you are in power, minus the, say, environmental cost, and then there is a repayment of these bonds. So the donor's payoff can be that you dislike, so just for simplification for some of the formulas, I let delta, 1 plus delta be the cost also for the donor to pay money. So you're paying money up front, that is the quantity of the loan, but you're getting something in return, which is the expected rate of return when policy Y is chosen. And then why are you doing all these things? Partly because you might have a damage when there is a lot of extraction or deforestation. So you are basically, this is the payoff then for the donor. So what is possible to implement is going to be the same as before. The cost of implementing is the same as before in the sense that if I want to implement less deforestation levels, I must issue a loan which gives a lower rate of return when a low deforestation rate is chosen. But because I'll get a lower rate of return, the incumbent will be able to borrow less, and that's bad for the incumbent at time one, just as before. So it's a bit similar, but of course, the first condition for what is the optimal Y will now depend also on the damage for this donor. So I think that to understand, so maybe the most interesting here is, or the way of seeing this, is to think about an alternative instrument to influence Y. Suppose that the donor can alternatively motivate a Y, which is chosen at time one, by compensating directly the policymaker at time one. As I mentioned, this is how, for example, Norway currently is motivating conservation or less tropical forest deforestation in countries like Brazil. But by comparing the cost of reducing Y by paying P1 versus by giving this kind of policy contingent loan, then one can show that the saving for the donor to implement a particular Y is going to be always positive when delta is positive and P is less than 1. But the saving instead is 0 if P is 1, for example. Why? Because if P is 1, that means that the incumbent at type 0 is going to stay in power with probability 1. In that case, there is no the value function. The value function for the policymaker at time 0 is going to coincide with the value function at time 1 because it's going to be the same policymaker with probability 1. But if P is less than 1, that is when the incumbent at time 0 is worried that the next policymaker is going to deforest more, because it might be from a different party who is going to value the revenues especially much because they can get this delta. And when that situation arises, the incumbent at time 0 has a desire and a benefit of tying the hands of solving the timing consistency problem by influencing the future choice of Y. And this loan, by signing on this loan, which is issued by, for example, from the World Bank, they can to some extent solve their own timing consistency problem. Because by accepting this loan where the repayment is going to be smaller if a smaller Y is chosen, they can induce the next policymaker to select a Y which they like more. That is a benefit for the incumbent at time 0, and therefore they will accept to implement a Y at a smaller cost, thanks to their own benefit from influencing their opponent or the next policymaker. So basically, by this loan allows the incumbent to solve a domestic timing consistency problem, and therefore you can implement more deforestation, more conservation, for example, at a lower cost than if the donor is waiting and paying P1 directly. So okay, so let me stop there. So what I was planning to do in the next few slides is to show in an example that if I take a model of the cost of deforestation, which is by Lars Peter Hansen and 3 quarters, then they are estimating how costly it is to conserve tropical forest in Brazil. I can take the exact same model. I allow for the possibility that the incumbent might not stay in power forever, and there might be some delta, which is better motivated in a paper I have on the conservation multiplier in GP 2 years ago. Then I can show that the cost saving, the cost of the grant to P1 is the constant line. If P, the probability that the incumbent stays in power to the next period, if that is also 1, then the cost of, okay, so the cost that the blue line is the cost of the forest-linked loan. That is the same. But if P is less than 1, then the incumbent at time 0 prefers to tie the hands of the next policymaker. And the smaller is P, the larger is this desire. And therefore, you can implement like a particular level of conservation at a lower cost, the smaller is P. Okay, so I think I'm running out of time. So there were so many things I would like to discuss, but let me stop so that we have time for a couple of questions. Because I would love to get your comments.
Thank you. So if someone has a question now, please go ahead. Let me know, or otherwise we can turn off the recording and see if someone has
Otherwise,
a
I can
question.
continue I can go back to the extensions and talk more.
Let me pause the recording now to see whether people have questions after pausing the recording, and then if there's no more questions, you can also continue on the way to the hour.